China's housing system used to be really bizarre. Unlike here in the US and frankly many parts of the world, anyone is allowed to buy a house if they can afford one. However, in China, that wasn't always the case. Prior to 1998, China's real estate market operated under a socialist-like welfare housing system. Basically, citizens were not allowed to own property. The government owned all the real estate and it rented out the housing to its urban residents. But in 1998, that all changed when the Chinese government announced the end of the welfare housing provision. This would allow private citizens to own property. And in just over 2 short decades, China went from being a country dominated by government-regulated renters to a country with the highest rate of home ownership. Today, over 90% of Chinese households own their home. And to give you some perspective, the home ownership rate in the US is about 65%. In Canada, it's about 64%, and in the UK, it's also about 65%. Now, on the surface, this seems like an amazing accomplishment. In just over 2 short decades, China was able to become a country with the largest rate of home ownership. But that kind of makes you wonder, given China's history of censorship and hiding important details about their economy from the rest of the world, is it true that 90% of Chinese citizens actually own their homes, or is something being left out? And even more importantly, despite what the Chinese government calls home ownership, do the citizens of China actually feel like homeowners? In other words, do they own homes that they can actually live in? Imagine for a second that I handed you a piece of paper and it had a blueprint of a house on it. And I said to you, hey, so this house isn't built yet, but if you buy it now, we'll build it. And once it's finished being built, well, you already bought the house. And so you can just move right in and you don't have to worry about, competition on the market or anything like that. And so I convinced you to go to the bank, put some money down to get a mortgage so that you can buy this house, which remember, technically hasn't been built yet, but it will be built eventually. But then after a couple of years, your house still hasn't been built yet. Perhaps some construction has started on it, but it's nowhere near living condition, and so it's not like you can move in. And yet, even though the house isn't built yet, and that's completely out of your control, the bank still expects you to start paying a mortgage. And if you don't pay your mortgage, then, well, some really bad things are gonna happen to not only you, but to your kids, and possibly even your grandkids. I don't know, that seems like a pretty good arrangement, wouldn't you agree? I'd like to introduce you to China's real estate presale system. The presale system is what allows Chinese citizens to buy a home in China's land-scarce economy before the home is actually even built. And oftentimes, you're buying the home before construction even begins. Now, keep in mind, you aren't actually living in the home yet. However, the banks in China still expect you to start paying a mortgage. Now, this system isn't unique to China, and they certainly weren't the ones to create it. Hong Kong has been using the presale system since the 1950s, and it's worked extremely well for them. But in the 90s, China introduced the presale system within their real estate market. And for the past 3 decades now, at least from the outside, it appears to have boosted their economy. China's real estate market now accounts for nearly 30% of the country's entire GDP, contributing about $4 trillion out of their $14 trillion economy. However, if you take a closer look inside, then you'll actually realize that their real estate market is, well, a house of cards.
I feel like we've been talking about this same story over the past, decade or so. There's always this great big rolling ball of debt, of losses when it comes to the Chinese economy, and the question is always, where does that land?
China's real estate market drives about 1/3 of China's economic activity. In fact, Chinese citizens are encouraged to buy as much real estate as they can as a way to invest and grow their money. The problem, though, is that if you live in China, then you really don't have any other way to invest your money. You see, unlike here in the US, where we have the stock market that we can put our money into to grow it, the Chinese stock market is way too volatile to invest in long term. A simple look at the SSE Composite Index, which is one of China's most popular stock market indexes, will show you just how volatile their stock market is. Additionally, China's banks pay virtually nothing in the form of interest, and so it doesn't really make sense to keep your money in a savings account because it's not going to grow. And so the only place left to put your money is into the housing market. However, given the sheer size of China's population relative to the size of the country, eventually the mass desire for real estate led to a massive overheating of the real estate market in 2020, where homeowners would often buy houses before they were even built using the presale system. Now, this system works in Hong Kong, and we even use it here in the US. In fact, it's not unusual to buy a house that hasn't yet been built. However, the presale system can only work if developers are held accountable, and who else can hold them accountable except for a higher authority figure? the government. And for decades, Hong Kong's government has worked hard to protect consumer rights. For example, a developer can only offer pre-sales if that developer actually has the financial ability to complete the project. And the money that the homebuyer puts down on the pre-sale funds are kept safe with lawyers and only released to developers as construction progresses. However, this is where China messed up. Although the Chinese government has introduced several policies to help regulate the use of pre-sale funds, the powerful Chinese business owners and elites essentially control the government, which makes it sort of corrupt. And of course, they do want access to these pre-sale funds even before they start development on a project. And so what do? Well, just like any corrupt government, they create regulations that will benefit them. And so what's happening is Chinese citizens are paying for these pre-sale homes, but their interests are not being protected. Massive companies like Evergrande would continue to accept pre-sale money as a way to fund future pre-sale projects instead of using that pre-sale money to build the homes in which they were paid for. And these multi-billion-dollar developers who are in charge of these pre-sale projects are relying on a continued flow of pre-sale money to continue coming in so that they can use that pre-sale money to finish older projects. But of course, as a result, they're becoming massively over-leveraged. And it only takes just one small, tiny event to shake China's economy before this entire system collapses. Oh, wait a second. That one small, tiny event already happened. You may or may not remember the COVID-19 pandemic when the entire world was forced to shut down and we all had to be locked in our homes. Well, the pandemic actually boosted home sales in China even more, which further added stress to China's already overheated housing market, where homeowners would buy homes before they were even built. However, to address concerns about the real estate market, China did eventually crack down on excessive borrowing from developers like Evergrande. The problem, though, is that the Chinese government never actually regulated the real estate market, and so they had no idea that these developers were massively over-leveraged and had virtually zero cash on hand. Because remember, all the money that they were receiving from homebuyers was immediately being used to fund new projects, in addition to excessive borrowing using other methods such as bonds. And so once all this funding was cut off by the Chinese government, it immediately threw companies like Evergrande into massive financial strain. And to make matters worse, to this day, China still hasn't learned to live with the COVID-19 virus. The rest of the world has learned to live with it. Most of the world's economies are back in full throttle, but China is still locking down entire cities because of the virus. And because of this major event, what was already a poorly executed housing market in China has turned into something that's going to look worse than the 2008 financial crisis in the US, with property values set to drop by 30%. And if things couldn't get any worse, China's homebuyers are running out of patience with the real estate market. And so many of them have began boycotting their mortgages by not paying them. But this is a huge problem for Chinese citizens. If you recall earlier in the video, I mentioned that in China, if you don't pay your mortgage, then obviously your credit's gonna get messed up. And if that happens, then really bad things are gonna happen to not only you, but to your kids and potentially even your grandkids. You see, because in China, their credit system is multi-generational. Here in the US and in most parts of the world, if you mess up your credit score by not paying your bills in time, or by getting your car repossessed, or by getting a foreclosure on your home, well, fortunately, only your credit score is gonna be affected because you're responsible for your own decisions, right? And that makes sense to most of us. However, in China, if you mess up your credit score, not only will it affect you, but it will also affect your kids and potentially even your grandkids. Many schools, banks, and businesses won't accept the children of parents who have defaulted on loans or made poor financial decisions that damage their credit. And so for those Chinese citizens who have paid for a pre-sale home, they have to make the very difficult decision to either boycott their mortgage and stop making payments, which in turn will not only ruin their financial future but also their kids, or continue making payments on a home that isn't finished or doesn't even exist yet and could potentially never exist to protect their credit and their kids' credit. However, more and more people are choosing to boycott their mortgage, and this will inevitably increase the amount of defaults happening in China's already weak real estate economy. In 2007, the housing market crisis happened in the US because of an increase in mortgage defaults. And this housing market crisis is what triggered the 2008 global financial crisis that severely damaged economies around the world. And so if this trend continues, Chinese developers not finishing homes, which then causes Chinese citizens to stop paying their mortgage, which then causes forced loan suspensions, and if you combine this with the existing issues in China's economy, it's the perfect recipe for China to have their own version of the 2007 housing market crash that we had here in the US. And with all of this, there's one question that comes to my mind, and that's how is this going to affect the rest of the world, but especially the US, considering our trade relations with China? Because when this happened to the US's housing market back in 2007, that's what triggered the 2008 financial crisis, which sent shockwaves around the world, and some economies around the world have yet to recover from that 2008 financial crisis. And so will the same exact thing happen if China's real estate market collapses? Well, unfortunately, no one really knows the answer to that question. Certainly, because of our trade relations with China, we would feel some type of shockwave here in the US. But the only thing that we can do is just continue investing, keeping our heads up, and dropping a like down below for the YT algo if you have not done so already, and subscribing to the channel. Also, if you have not already gotten your 12 free stocks from Webull valued up to $36,000 for opening up a Webull account and depositing just 1 penny, use the link down below in the description or the pinned comment. Hey, you guys are amazing. You really are. I hope you have an awesome rest of your day or night. And as always, I will see you again very soon. Take care.